viewpoint that you take when it comes to analyzing political decisions?
Sure. Well, I think that Jewish values undergird my politics to a certain extent, just because values in general undergird people's values. But every argument that I make, I believe, has to have a secular rationale, because whenever I'm arguing with people who don't share my biblical worldview, it doesn't make any sense for me to cite the Chumash or Tanakh in order for me to make the point. They don't share the same basis of authority that I do. So I think that it shapes my moral worldview, not necessarily with regard to what government should and should not do, although I think there is some of that, but more with regard to what people should and should not do. I make a pretty hard distinction between what I think is good for human beings and what I think government ought to force human beings to do.
Absolutely. One of the major things that has kind of come into the foreground now with the last two administrations are the role that observant Jews have. What do you feel like observant Jews should be doing when it comes to politics, the danger or the opportunity of playing up a person's religious observance, etc.?
So I worry less about playing up religious observance than the fact that if you believe that Jews were meant to be a light unto the nations, if you take the biblical injunction to spread that light seriously, then avoiding the realm of politics seems to me completely foolhardy. This idea that we're sort of going to ghettoize ourselves and not engage in the political debate, and therefore we leave issues of major consequence to moral people of all stripes, to people who disagree with us on a fundamental level. I think that's a huge mistake. And I'm not just talking about Israel. I'm talking about issues like abortion or same-sex marriage. I'm talking about issues of personal responsibility and how you operate a business. Issues of religious freedom that obviously impact every Orthodox Jew in the country. If you leave that field empty and you just wait for other people to do your dirty work and defend you, I think that you are doing the Jewish people and yourself a disservice.
On a personal level, is there a certain level of fear that you have going in terms of representing your community? Obviously, there is a large historical precedent of Jews being involved with politics, but oftentimes that Jews are frankly afraid, so to speak, to stand up for themselves, as they don't, sometimes as they're sometimes victim of their opinions, and when political tides turn, they usually try to just sort of, I guess you could say, stay in the background. Is that a personal concern that you're worried about facing your community,
I've always thought that was a little bit overblown. Like, I think there's a myth that's pushed forward by the Orthodox, and I grew up, going to EULA, and I went to Maimonides for junior high, and there is this kind of tendency to say things like, well, whenever Jews become prominent in a particular country, then the backlash against Jews is really strong. And the answer to that is, when Jews are not prominent in a particular country, the backlash against Jews is very strong. So, and that seems like a category error. The problem is not Jews becoming powerful as Jews, like as religiously observant Jews. The problem is that whenever there is a backlash against any movement, Jews tend to be at the forefront of any movement, whether you're talking secular or religious. So we might as well promulgate the values that Judaism stands for, as opposed to, for example, being blamed for Bolshevism because so many leaders of Bolshevism happen to be ethnically Jewish but religiously atheist.
Fantastic. Now, if depending on who you ask, you could say either the Jews are in a terrible situation now, we're in a very advantageous, opportunistic situation. Where do you fall on that continuum?
So I think that you have to gauge it along two lines. It depends on what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to history, Jews have never been in a better position. I mean, if you're just comparing it to world history, Jews have not been in a better position since probably Moses came down with the tablets. It's been a long time since there was an independent Jewish state that has an enormous amount of power, a very solid fighting military, connections, deep and abiding connections with the most powerful country in the history of the world, in the United States. If you look at it in terms of where they stand compared to where they were 10 years ago, it depends on which angle you take. If you're looking at where they stand compared to the Palestinians, I would say much better off. Compared to Saudi Arabia, much better off. Egypt, much better off. Iran, much worse off, right? The Iranian forwarding of regional power under the Obama administration has been quite disastrous. I don't think the Europeans were ever to be counted on in terms of support for the Jews or the Jewish state. I would say that Jews in Europe have it much worse off than they did even 20 years ago. But it depends where you're talking about. Jews in America have it great. Jews in France do not. Jews in Israel have it great. Jews in Germany are experiencing problems, or Sweden are experiencing problems. So it depends on the country. Overall, I'm free to practice my religion. I'm free to wear a yarmulke in public. I'm free to talk openly about my belief system. And not only that, I'm encouraged to do so. And Israel is one of the most powerful states on the planet in terms of a place where lots of Jews live and that's supposed to represent Jewish values. So I'm an optimist as far as where I think Jews are globally right now.
Fantastic. One of the things that you can't ignore, obviously, is that so many of our Jewish brethren are on the, so to speak, the left side of the fence and are advocating very strongly against this administration and all the stuff that basically he stands for and it stands for. And there are very few Jewish conservative voices on the right who are practicing like yourself. When you are trying to advocate for the positions, if you are speaking specifically to the community as much as you'd want to say it from a national component or an international component, what would you tell Jews that they should be focusing on, that they should try to listen to get sort of in line with the way that you see the world?
I mean, honestly, I don't think that I have to preach to other Orthodox Jews, many of whom know more about Judaism than I do. I'm not a rabbi. I think that when there's a reason that Orthodox Jews vote largely Republican and supported President Trump overwhelmingly in the last elections. When you talk about Jews being to the left, you're really talking about conservative and Reformed Jews. The conservative movement is basically breaking down and falling apart. They're either moving modern Orthodox or they're moving toward the Reform, which means really toward secularism. So that means that if you're going to talk about Jews being to the left, you have to determine, are you talking about people who actually care about Judaism and Jewish priorities, or are you talking about people who are ethnically Jewish and like to go to synagogue on Yom Kippur for half a day before they break for lunch? And I think that makes a big difference because I don't tend to care about ethnic Judaism very much. I think it's an almost worthless category. I think that religious Judaism, what you practice is what you are. And so, even appealing to ethnic Jews as Jews, I think is sometimes a mistake, because why would I assume that they have any sort of deep and abiding care for Jewish values, for Torah values, for the state of Israel? The vast majority of Reformed Jews care significantly more about same-sex marriage and are pro-same-sex marriage than they do about the fate of the state of Israel, which they seem to be sort of uncomfortable with. I mean, there's a reason that the post-Zionist movement has largely sprung from the anti-religious community.
Absolutely. And so the question would be, I guess, do you see to engage these people in conversation in any more meaningful way than you would anybody else? Or do you feel like there's a certain point that the Jewish community reaches by which you just say, you're kind of off the grid, so to speak, and I'm just going to go about my daily business?
I mean, I think you have to gauge people individually. So it depends. There are some Jews who are not Orthodox. I don't want to suggest that all Orthodox Jews are doing great and non-Orthodox Jews are doing horribly in terms of politics. There are many Jews that I talk to who are not Orthodox who still hold value with regard to sort of traditional biblical values in certain ways, even if they're not keeping Shabbat or Kashrut. There are a lot of non-Orthodox Jews who have significant love for the state of Israel, and I think you can talk to people who believe in those things, but you have to gauge what are the things that people value and then talk to them about those values. I think trying to browbeat somebody who doesn't care particularly much about Israel by saying, well, your last name has a steen at the end of it, therefore I'm going to talk to you about Israel is making a foolish mistake.
Absolutely. How did you get into politics? I ask you to answer this question with an eye on the fact that there are so many young people, college people, post-college people, where politics has largely kind of fallen out of, if it ever was, of discussion, and people just aren't paying attention. So what was your personal path, and how would you advocate for someone to get more involved if they should?
I mean, so I was always interested in politics, but when I went to college, I didn't think that I was going to be in political science. I thought that I was going to major in genetic science and music, actually, because I'm a violinist. And so what really got me into politics in a formal way is I was on campus. I picked up the student newspaper. There was an article comparing Ariel Sharon to Adolf Eichmann. I walked into the op-ed office and I asked if I could write a counter. And that turned into a regular column, which turned into a syndicated column, and it sort of went from there. So the question is, number one, do you have the passion? Number two, do you have the skill? And number three, do you have anything that's worth saying? If you do, then I think that politics is a good place for you. I would suggest that you start off by actually honing your craft, and that means writing for free or for very little money. Just like in any other business, you have to work your way up from the bottom. It wasn't like I was connected in politics. I wasn't. My parents worked in Hollywood. I didn't know anyone in the business of politics. I basically applied cold for my syndicated column and then just took advantage of the opportunities that were presented to me from there. But a lot of it has to do with, you actually have to put in the hard work. I mean, you have to do the reading. You have to spend time engaging with the issues and discussing with people you disagree with. And if that's something that fascinates you, then you can start thinking about, is my viewpoint something that needs to be promulgated? And if so, how do I find an outlet willing to publish it? And sometimes that means writing for free.
Absolutely. But do you share in sort of the hand-wringing and the general fear that a lot of these very large Jewish lobbies have, where they say that the kids just don't care? Or you feel pretty optimistic? You say those that care.
I mean, care I think that's I would be worried that there are so many Jewish kids who don't care about Israel or Jewish values. But as far as not caring about politics more broadly, most people who are young don't care about politics. So the idea that people are just disengaged, I don't know why they think that people who don't engage politically or in terms of values are going to engage with politics just because they're ethnically Jewish. Again, it's that distinction that makes all the difference. Your values determine whether you're going to become politically engaged or not. If you have a problem with people being politically engaged, maybe you should look to the fact that you're you're pushing values that no one finds interesting or worthwhile. If you actually were doing a better job pushing your values and kids actually engaged with them, then they have a tendency to become more political.
Two final questions. How did you find your own value system? And are you in the belief that a person should be consistently questioning those? How do you settle on those value systems, and how do you cross-examine them?
So I think that you should always be looking at the hard questions. I think that avoiding the hard questions is foolish. By the same token, I think looking for 100% certainty in any religious faith is foolish. I think that the idea that you're ever going to come up with I'm 100% certain that everything I believe is 100% factually true, that's just not the nature of faith. And therefore, and that's true for any value system, by the way. It's not just true of religion. It's also true of people who believe in secular humanism, who refuse to examine their underlying motivations or their underlying assumptions. And when they do, very often those underlying assumptions simply fall apart. Like when atheists, some of the new atheist crowd, people like Bill Maher, will talk about human rights, and you ask them, okay, where do human rights come from? They have a hard time explaining. It's an article of faith for them. That's fine, but you have to actually say it's an article of faith for me, and what is your justification for the faith? So I think looking at the hard questions is something that we should be doing. It's also something I think that Jewish high schools and junior highs should be engaging with, because I think that one of the problems, particularly in the Orthodox community, to be really parochial here, one of the big problems is that a lot of people who are Orthodox go through the school system, they hit college, and they've never actually asked any of these questions. They're hit with one of these questions, and they don't know how to handle it at all. And there are good answers, even if they're answers that people may not end up believing. There are good answers to a lot of the questions that are being asked. I mean, I'm actually writing a book on some of this stuff right now, because I think that it's important to constantly be examining where your worldview comes from. The best argument, I think, in favor of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and I say that because it's the Judaic worldview that was broadened and in terms of audience by Christianity. The best argument for that is that it's created the greatest civilization in the history of the world, bar none. And so I think that pride in Western civilization inherently means pride in certain Jewish values, even if you're refusing to acknowledge that debt.
Absolutely. To what extent do you feel what is the greatest challenge facing the Jewish community today from your perspective, based on the work that you do and sort of the 30,000 feet view that you have?
I think the greatest problem is that disconnect that we're talking about right now between promulgation of religious values and kids who are growing up not seeing any of that. And I think that holds true in a couple of ways. I think number one, there are just a lot of Jews who are born into Jewish families who don't know anything about Judaism and have not been taught in any coherent and cohesive way about Jewish philosophy. And I think that holds true also for people who grew up from. I think people who are FFB are not taught how to handle questions that are coming at them from the outside. And so increasingly, as we live in an open and engaged society, people are going to fall away from the faith if they aren't armed with answers. And that's certainly even more true of people who don't have any engagement with the faith to begin with.
Final question. What do you think is the solution to that problem? Is it a family situation? Is it a synagogue situation, which of course is a big problem because so many of these people aren't going to synagogue? Or is it the book that you're writing? How do we solve that problem or attempt to solve those problems?
I mean, I think it's all of the above. I think that in the end, it always comes down to family. But in order for families to be influenced by ideas, there have to be people speaking those ideas. So the fact that I'm writing a book, or the fact that I'm trying to speak on biblical values, and I do a Bible segment every Wednesday, and the fact that I try and take seriously questions of faith, I'll go and I'll debate Sam Harris. I think that that's valuable. I think that more Orthodox Jews need to be doing it. And frankly, I'm sort of astonished and appalled that it's been left to me, a guy who was, Baal Tshuva at age 11 and never went to yeshiva in Israel for a year after high school to promulgate Jewish values. Maybe that's because, I've spent so much time engaging with secular values, but it would behoove the Orthodox community to produce some people who can speak cogently about these ideas, because when Jews do speak cogently about their faith, they have something to say.
That's fantastic. I know you have to go. If you could just nail in that 2 last seconds, that's an unbelievable idea. How does a person that is a Baal Tshuva, someone that comes sort of later to faith, you came at 11, I came at 18, and, kind of has this media role, how do we address those challenges of, I guess you'd say, I don't have enough of a background? When in reality, you're the one that's doing it. It's amazing. So how have you mitigated the fear or the concern about inauthentically representing your
So, the first thing that I always say is that I'm not a posek, so I'm not going to sit around and paskin halacha for you. But what I will say is that when you look at Jewish hashkafa philosophy is broad enough that it encompasses a fair bit of ground. There are differences, major differences between even classic commentators like Rambam and Abarbanel. So the idea that it can't encompass the sort of root philosophy that I'm espousing, I think what I'm saying is usually I'm talking about the basics of Judaism is the truth. It's very rare that I'm talking about any abstract or abstruse portion of halakha. Like it comes up sometime. It's come up, I think, once in a speech where somebody asked me about halachic differences in my opinion on abortion, and I'll have to cite Moshe Feinstein as opposed to citing Waldman. But the bottom line is that that's stuff that tends to come up in very minority contexts with people who are already engaged inside the Orthodox community. In terms of promulgating, broad nature Jewish values, I don't think that those they're not in heaven, right? I think that we are pretty familiar with them, and one of the reasons we're familiar with them is because they're already embodied in a lot of our culture and civilization.
100%. Ben, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much.
Thank you.